All right. Let's jump into it. All right. Um, Thank you everyone for joining. I hope you're all very excited to talk about how to work with large data sets in Hex because I certainly am. For today, I'll walk through a little bit about Hex and go through some examples of how you can work with large data sets in Hex, and then I'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. So uh, save your questions for the end and excited to get some good engagement when we get there. Cool. All right. So for a little intro for people who may not be as familiar with Hex, we're in a Hex project right now, and a Hex project has two parts. We have the notebook and the app builder, where the notebook you can write in SQL, Python, text, table, basically do analysis with whatever tool you want, whatever type of language capability you want. And then once you're ready to present and share that analysis, you can go to the app builder and share that out, put together the presentation layer to share out with end users. And this could be a simple report or an analytics white paper or a full-blown dashboard that might look something like this. Okay, for today, we're going to spend the bulk of the time in the notebook view here. And, in today's world of technology, we have more data than ever. And it's important to be able to get insights from this rich set of data, but notebooks, BI tools, spreadsheets, whatever you might be using to work off of it, they tend to run out of memory and you might have to aggregate data or not, or download it. And Hex is really powerful in allowing you to work with as large scales of data, millions, even billions of rows of data. And that's because your data warehouse is really powerful and Hex allows you to take full advantage of it. So I'll walk through an example of how you might want to be able to query a lot of data and then see some trends. And in this example, maybe we'll look at some Snowflake data and look at City Bike to understand what trips look like and create a forecast for it. And in my schema browser here, my data browser here, I have access to my Snowflake environment, which has already been set up. And basically, Hex allows you to use the full scale and infrastructure of your data warehouse. And any limitations that you have run into working off of the data is from the limitations of your data warehouse. And as we know, Snowflake's super powerful. So I'll show you how you can work with a lot of data at once. I'm just going to bring in my City Bike trips data here. And by default, it's going to create a select star in a SQL cell with the limit 100. We don't want to limit it to 100. We're going to remove that. And I'm going to return this as in query mode, which, as you see here, leaves the full result set in the data warehouse. And that means that we're pushing down compute. We're using the full infrastructure of Snowflake and just basically have a pointer returning this data. You can see that we're working off of 20 million rows of data here, and it returned in less than a second. Now I have this query mode object that I can continue to work off of. I'll give it a nice name, like trips. And I'll continue to build off of it. I might want to visualize it and see what my average duration looks like by user type, customers and subscribers. And I can do it really easily here off of that 20 million rows of data. And what's happening here is it's just behind the scenes as Hex is aggregating the data to the level needed for this visualization. I can also create a pivot table if I want to understand which stations have the longest trip durations. Average it here. And maybe look at the top ones. So I'll sort this descending. And really, Hex allows you to use query mode to work off of that 20 million, hundreds of millions, billions of rows of data while leaving the result set in your data warehouse using the power of your data warehouse. And also allowing you to just build out your analysis, looking in charts and pivot tables um, on all in one place. And now the question you might have is, can you use query mode for everything? And the answer is not quite, but you can use it to you can use it to work off of lots of data, look through the trends until you have to do more with it. So for example, let's say that I want to build a forecast model on this data, looking at forecasting out my future trips. So in that case, in order to work with a Python cell to create that model, I would need the data in memory. And what I can do in Hex is I can chain my SQL and reference that data frame I have above. So I have, let's do a select star from that trips data frame that I just created, which is query mode object. And I'll do my start time, cast that as the date. And that'll be my start date. And just bring in the data that I need. I'll have a count star here just to get my total trip count. And I'll do a group by. And of course, the demo gods are not happy about this. So let me see what we can do here with some magic. Here, actually, I'll delete this and I'll rerun my project from scratch. I'll just copy in this cell. It's also important to make sure you're working in the right data connection, and we're actually working off of this demo one. For most of you, probably don't have that many data connections. So here. So basically what I did there was I referenced that trips query mode object from above and just chained it, built off of it. And now I'm returning it instead of a query mode as a data frame. And this will bring it into Hex's memory. You can tell it's in Hex's memory because it's green. And I'll give it a nice name. This will be trips by date. And from here, I can build out my profit model. So I will add a Python cell and just paste in this code where I'm creating a profit model and referencing that trips by date that I just created, which is another superpower of Hex, is just being able to jump between SQL and Python and charts seamlessly without having to switch tools. Now I've run this and have a beautiful model that I created. So just to recap, we were able to pull in the data from the data warehouse, work off of 20 million rows of city bike data, and then transform it to get it to the shape that I need to be before bringing it into my memory and using Python on top of it. And you might be asking, when might you need to bring things into memory to work in Hex? So as you saw earlier, query mode works in SQL and charts, pivot tables. The times where you would bring it in memory would be what I did earlier here, where I'm working it off of a data frame mode. And then also if I'm working with it in Python, that if this were a query mode object, that would also bring it into Hex memory. And then the last way is just a write back cell. If you create anything in write back cell, that will also bring it into Hex's memory. So you can work with large datas at scale off of the infrastructure of your data warehouse, and then aggregate it to the level that you need before doing the profit model or segmentation or whatever you want to do in Python. Okay, cool. So now we have the idea of Hex's memory. What are the limitations of memory? Well, there's many things that you could and might want to do in memory, but as with everything, there are limits. And just a little bit of background, Hex's projects are powered by a kernel, which executes your code and manages your compute resources. Each Hex project has compute profile options that you can use to customize your memory limit and power, and you can find that here in the Environments tab. Under Environments, we have the compute profile, and you can adjust the size of your compute to and memory to what you need. And so the question here might be, when might you want to bump up the size of your compute profile? Well, the first clue is actually down here in the lower right corner. We have memory usage down here, and you can see that I'm only using 187 megabytes out of 8, which is pretty good. Like, I have a lot of space left. So I don't need to bump this up. Like, even just working off of 20 million rows of data, a medium is more than enough. The times when you might want to adjust this is if you are hitting that out of memory error. If, for example, your memory usage is like 8 gigabytes, then you might want to do something. But as you can see with query mode, we're really not taking up that much memory. So you could push down, get away with working with a lot of data without having to bump that up. The other reason you might bump it up, and this is more niche, is for those Pythonistas out there or R pirates. If your goal is to speed up your project runtime, you might want to thread your code to use a compute profile with multiple CPUs. So really the crux of it is the compute profile gives you options once your data is in Hex's memory, but with query mode, you don't have to worry about that because a lot of the work can be offset to the data warehouse. Okay, we talked a lot about query mode and writing Python in memory, but is there a way to write Python without having to bring it into memory? And the answer is if you're using Snowflake, then yeah, you can. So I'll pull up the data browser again. Here we have a integration with Snowpark where it's basically executing on Snowflake's infrastructure. And what's happening behind the scenes is that Snowpark would write data frames as a Snowflake temporary table. And that will allow you to work with Snowpark data frames in SQL, in Python, chart cells, and basically be able to do end-to-end analysis in Snowpark. So let me give an example of what that looks like. We'll start with the new analysis. I'll query my city bike data again, and we don't want that limit. Instead of returning it as a data frame, I'm going to toggle it over to Snowpark. And again, you see that happen pretty instantaneously. We're working off of 20 million rows of data, and this is all being pushed down to Snowflake. I'll call this my trips 2. And now I would, in order to work with Snowpark in a Python cell, I'll need to first start the session. And luckily we have this easy button that will auto-generate the code for you to get the session started. And now that the session is started, I can use Python to write whatever functions, whatever I want. And so let's say that I want to process this for my machine learning workflow, and I want to normalize my trip duration data here. I can import this Snowflake library that allows me to do that pre-processing. And basically any library that you have in Snowflake and Snowpark is accessible. All you have to do is import it. And then I'll use that library to work with this trips data frame, which you can see here. It says Snowpark data frame. That's how you know. And run the code to get my normalized data. And so from here, I have the normalized data, and I can also continue to build off of it, create charts, etc. And so really with Snowpark, you can do that sort of end-to-end analysis, even machine learning, while basically keeping it fully in Snowflake's infrastructure. And so today I had talked about basically allowing you to work with really large data in Hex because you have the ability, you have all of the data warehouse infinite scale behind you. You have access to that with query mode, where it pushes down compute and also just leaves the result in the data warehouse. So you're not bringing it into memory, and you can work off of that. The times where you bring it into memory, again, is those Python cells. So you might want to aggregate things, get it into the shape you need to build out the forecast analysis or segmentation or whatever else you're doing. And when you do work in memory, you can adjust and look at the memory and compute profile both down here and in the environments tab. And then finally, for those who are working with Snowflake, you have access to Snowpark, where you can do everything on Snowflake's infrastructure. So that was a high-level overview of how you can work with really large scales of data in HAX. Okay, I'm going to open it up for Q&A now, and it looks like we have quite a few folks chat messages. And if you have any more, feel free to just drop it in the webinar chat and I will get to it. Okay, the first one says disregard. Justin says the number one challenge my team has, even with the Snowflake instance, is joining tables to in-memory data frames. There are times when it is seamless and sometimes it feels like it doesn't work at all, where it thinks I'm looking at, oh, this chat keeps moving, where it thinks I'm keep looking at a table name, not a data frame. It feels like there are times when it works and when it doesn't work in the notebook and it throws an error. I'm really interesting situation here, Justin. I'm curious what that actually looks like. I think a lot of times when we are working with joining data from both from your data warehouse to data frames in HAX, there's quite a few different options, so it's important to make sure it's the right one. I think the biggest one, and maybe you already know this, but the biggest one is making sure if you're joining sources from different data frames from different sources together, to just make sure it's in data frame mode, which would bring it into memory. That's another case where it would bring it into memory. Okay, let's see. What else? Will this webinar be available later for review? Yes, this webinar will be available later. We'll send out a follow-up with a recording as well as the project. Oh, I skipped one. How can we display the results to users and viewers? Oh, that's a great question. So what I can do now, this is all in the notebook side. And everything I built in the notebook side can be arranged in the app builder to then share out to stakeholders. So I can basically bring in, let me just auto-generate it. Magic will auto-generate some results here. And you can move things around. You can add text for context. So I can say city bike analysis and maybe give a meaningful description of how to use this data and basically create a really nice presentation layer to then share out with my end users. And I will hit the publish button, which will give me a whole host of options, including who to share it out with, as well as the ability to actually publish it and send the link to my end users. Okay. How do we display results on mobile? That's a really good question. I think as with a lot of these tooling, we are not optimized for mobile. So you could pull it up on your phone, but it might or might not be in the shape that that you might want. But I think really if you do want to create it for mobile, it'll take some like trial and error to just play around and make sure the sizing is right. I think there's a whole separate sort of best practices for building for mobile that we won't cover today. Let's see. Hi, I'm working on a number of multi-select filters that need to be applied downstream to all cells in the Publish app. There are 5+ filters. This keeps moving. Okay, there are 5+ filters that are all children of the previous. I was instructed by Hex to add an additional cell in between the two input parameters to filter the input being passed into the second parameter. Is there a way to build these filters without bringing them into memory? I see. Okay, so you're using, and for folks who are not familiar with input parameters, we also have these inputs that, like let's say a number input that you can use as a parameter and insert into your code. So whether that's SQL or Python to reference. And so if I were to update this to another number, that will trickle through to my code. And I guess for your question, Anona, can you build the filters without bringing them into memory? Yeah, you can do that with Jinja in SQL. So if I were to reference this input, let's see, maybe I can make this like 500. I'll do a select star from trips to, and I can do a reference of where my trip duration is greater than, and then I can reference that input parameter using Jinja here, input one. Just have that be returned in query mode. Like that. All right. Sonia says, I'm experiencing issues with filters in the app being really slow. Any tips? Ooh, that is definitely a broader topic, and there could be a lot of things that lead to it. I think overall tips would be, if you can, you do have the option to parameterize filters um, in the SQL query in query mode, like I did here. That might help. I think there's a lot of factors into it as well, as such as what's the source data? Are you bringing it into memory or not? How big is it? Are you working with it in code cells? So I think um, there's a lot of things that can go into it. We do have in our docs memory management in Hex, and maybe this will be helpful just for memory basics and push down. It's a lot of the stuff that I covered today. And then we also have more documentation in here around like performance optimization. So I recommend looking through here. I think I can actually just search it. Yeah, query caching for performant objects, improving performance, query caching in general also can be helpful. So yeah, definitely recommend also looking into the docs for some of these resources, such as like heavy compute apps. Let's see. Ted says, will the Snowflake ML functions present even greater opportunities for pushing heavy lifting to the database? In the meantime, we'll try Snowpark you showed, a neat trick to speed things up and avoid bringing huge amounts of data back to the client. Yeah, I would say that the ML functions, um, it does give more opportunity to push heavy lifting, uh, I guess like activities to the data warehouse because it allows you to do your Python activities on top of your data warehouse. Whereas if you're not using Snowpark, you would be bringing data into memory before using Python and Hex. Okay. Anona says, related to above question, I am then trying to apply these filters to 350 million rows of data, and the cell consistently takes 5 minutes to run, and it times out in the kernel. Yeah, that is definitely a large amount of data. And without seeing your uh, app, it's hard for me to give specific advice on this, but there should be some things to do with regards to that. It might have also to do, one thing that might be helpful is this graph execution view here. And let me pull this up. So this has a DAG of basically all the things that are going on in your project. And what's really neat is that it has also the amount of time that each cell took to run. So I think the first step too in helping to optimize for performance is to take a look at the DAG and see where your longest running queries or jobs are happening, and then seeing if there are ways that you can cut that down or streamline it. I would play around and see if like doing things differently, maybe splitting something up, will help reduce the runtime here. And especially for those that are upstream, like this data frame here, trips. If this is taking like 20 seconds to run and I have 5 things underneath it, that's going to be a big bottleneck. So wherever you can, like make the things upstream more performant. Let's see. Are our users able to filter by date or other fields? Yeah, Yeah, you basically, if you have the field in the data warehouse, your users are able to filter it. There's a few options. A lot of people use these input parameters as filters where they reference the input parameters in the code. So in this case, I'm just filtering my trip duration by this input here. The other option you have for filtering is you can add sort of a global filter at the very top. So I can select from any of the data frames I have here, what I want to filter by. So maybe I want to add, this in my user type in my trip by date. Um, but as you can see, uh, you can also select any of the columns that are in the data frame to filter by. We love Hex, by the way. Keep it coming. Thank you, Justin. We love that. Anona says, hi, as a follow-up, it seems like I'm not able to select query mode for the filter because I'm using a summary table I created previously in the notebook. Is there another way around it? I guess like the question for you back is, why are you using it in a summary table? Are you able to just have the results in the SQL cell itself? Because if, for example, you're sharing that out with the end user, when I do bring the SQL cell in, it displays as a table, and that's what my end users would see. So if that works for you, then you can sort of bypass that using the summary table view. Okay. Um, Fuad says, I think it might be preferable to do transformations using DBT or other ETL tools that only connect data mart or gold tables with less required transformation to Hex for small last minute work. Hex is great, way better than many other BI tools out there. Why, thank you. And I agree about it being better to do transformations in DBT or other ETL tools as much as you can do that upstream work. That is preferable, especially since you probably want your source of truth in your data warehouse. I think where Hex comes into play for especially a lot of these types of analysis is giving users the flexibility to do um, things that maybe you don't want to put into your data warehouse, or maybe it's like more temporary. So things that are more temporary and like is a one-off use case. So it gives users the flexibility to, use their source data, but also do the transformations they need to do their work. David says, I'm coming from another low-code tool, but I am seeing a lack of layout tools. Am I missing something? Are there examples I can see? Yeah, David, do you mean the app builder here? So the layout, just being able to create the presentation layer for your end users. So for example, here is where you can reorganize things. I can add, I'm not going to be able to make it pretty live, but I can reorganize things. I can add cells. I can add text, more description on this and move things around. And this isn't very pretty, but like an example that I had up earlier is something like this, where I can build out a fully built out dashboard or a report or analytics white paper, um, really allowing you to create whatever you want in terms of visualizations, but having access to anything that you built in the notebook. All right, we are at the half hour mark. So thank you everyone for joining and happy hexing.